Welcome to the podcast from the Internationalist Workers Group, where we discuss current events in the United States and around the world from a Marxist and communist perspective. The IWG is the U.S. affiliate of the Internationalist Communist Tendency, which is an international organization for the constitution of a working class party. We aim to provide not only information that would be relevant for the working class in the United States, but also criticism of the media and the coverage of events by bourgeois sources. Our goal is to discuss a broader range of issues in a less formal structure than would be found in our literature or periodicals. However, the topics we discuss will always be relevant to revolutionary working class politics and the criticism of the current state of affairs in this country and abroad. So, why don't we get started with a few headlines? So, why not start with Russia and Ukraine? I guess Putin has now begun a partial mobilization, or if we can just call it a draft, because that's essentially what it is, right?
Yeah. So what's happening in Russia, and this is coming from headlines dated on the 22nd of this month, Putin has basically brought the draft back to Russia, what he's calling a partial mobilization, which includes the drafting of around 300,000 Russians. Most of these Russians, at least from reports we have, are coming from, let's just say, poor regions of the country, specifically the Caucasus and Siberia. They're kind of being, motivated to sign up, or not sign up, but to embrace the draft by being paid a wage that is around 5 times higher than the average. Of course, when you implement a draft again, there's going to be some backlash. We have seen an increase in protests again, which has led to, of course, crackdown by the police. And we have also seen video footage of Russian borders, specifically with places like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, in the Baltic regions, just flooded with military-aged men trying to get out of the country before, their little note card comes for them.
Yeah, and I've also seen, I believe I saw like a headline saying that Putin signed into law, 10 years in prison for anyone who deserts or anyone who retreats. So, I guess the motivation is not just that positive reinforcement with a higher wage, but you're gonna if you just think that you're gonna turn back, you better think again, because you're gonna end up in prison, which I'm sure is probably the worst thing in the world, or one of the worst things in the world, being in a Russian prison.
Yeah. I think, a lot of people are asking the question of why. Why is he doing this? And, just my own personal analysis. You have to be a little desperate if you're going to reintroduce a draft in a country that has not had the draft since World War II. So it seems to me that he's very much trying to break the stalemate that is currently the situation in Ukraine right now. The Ukrainian armed forces was able to do a better job than anyone really anticipated. And, he's just going to be sending more kids to the meat grinder, hoping to break this stalemate. If that fails, I don't know what he's going to do. Maybe a full mobilization and try again. I just wanted to briefly touch upon, relating it back to America and how, thinking about Iraq and Afghanistan, how was the United States able to do that for so long with, honestly, there were points in my life where I forgot that Afghanistan was even a war zone, because it just was not talked about. And the reason why it was not talked about is because there was no draft. It was an all-volunteer army. The people out there dying and doing the killing were literally signing up to do so. So if you want to keep a war going as long as possible and without any real oversight, you got to keep the war away from home. But now Putin has brought it right to their faces. So that, to me, signals that he is getting a little desperate, and it's just going to be a little interesting to see how Russia will respond, like its citizenry, its people.
Oh yeah. Also, though, with the stalemate that's been going on in the Ukraine and Russia, I mean, this has been like a war largely fought through like bombardment and artillery up until now, and I think that this could also represent Putin becoming frustrated with the lack of progress using like those more indirect like shelling methods, and like kind of triggering him to move towards like all out war. Also, like since it was a previously like volunteer army, like there's been some reports that they're having issues with just having enough soldiers to continue hostilities. So I think it could be coming from a few places, but I mean, at this point, like Russia is all in on this war. There's really no backing down for them. And I don't think it's really like surprising to see this mobilization at the same time that Putin is like alluding to the use of tactical nukes and stuff as well.
You know, briefly before continuing, it should be mentioned, it's not like Ukraine is in a really good position either. I didn't read the article, but I have seen a couple headlines floating around basically saying that Ukraine is taking prisoners out of prison and handing them a rifle and saying, go to the front. And that was just like within this week. And I think we should also talk about the absolutely atrocious liberal interpretation and reasoning for why refugees should actually be forced to suffer. I'm, of course, talking about the Estonian PM giving the really amazing political philosophical argument that citizens of a country are 100% responsible. And that is a term she used. She did say that they are responsible for this war, and as such, they should be made to suffer for it. Of course, what that really means in reality is we're not going to be accepting any military-age Russian that tries to enter our borders. They will go to Ukraine and kill or be killed because, you know, our political signaling about evil Russians is more important than trying to limit the amount of people in the army or in just having a heart.
I think that this like line of thought meshes so well with like liberal perspectives on like bourgeois democracy. Yep. Is almost like secondary to the real motivation for Estonia. Like, I feel like the unwillingness to take in refugees like has to be related to an unwillingness to like even entertain the thought of hostilities with Russia itself. Yeah. Like, I mean, on its face, the idea that the citizens of a country are 100% responsible for the actions of that country, like, is just so it's so over the top. Like, and Estonia does share a border with Russia, and I can't help but wonder like what part of that statement wasn't also motivated by like a desire to keep Estonia out of this war.
Well, that's actually the argument that has been brought out. Basically, the argument is that like, oh, if Estonia's population gets a significant Russian minority, Putin's going to invade. Except people don't seem to remember that Estonia is part of NATO. And so like the entire reason why Putin was able to invade Ukraine in the first place was because it was not a NATO country. That was the whole debate.
No, ultimately, like the trigger really was Ukraine pushing for NATO membership. I mean, this is still a proxy war between the US and NATO versus Russia just taking place in Ukraine. Exactly.
But like the reason why they were able to invade Ukraine, it was because it was pushing for NATO membership. It was not yet a NATO member. But if decides to march into Estonia, that would be directly attacking a NATO member. And I'm sorry, I don't think he's willing to do that. I don't think he's willing to actually go to war with NATO itself, not just through a proxy war. If that makes any sense.
I think that's probably true. It's of course because if any NATO member is attacked, all members go to war against
mobile war.
Yeah. It's interesting though because we've never actually seen anything like that. So I mean, there is this sort of march to generalized war with the imperialist epoch, but the question is, what will that look like in reality? Because ever since, we haven't had a generalized imperialist war since World War II. So now clearly, I don't really buy this whole Putin is a crazy person, and I don't think people who are, or any of us, or really anyone who's kind of looking at this from a materialist lens is gonna think that either. Yeah, maybe he might have some egomaniacal tendencies, but he doesn't seem like the kind of guy who just does things arbitrarily. So
he's not.
Yeah, so he's not gonna just if there are Russians in Estonia, he knows that means the end of, or that, not the end, but it means severe consequences, much more so than having volunteers or weapons sent to Ukraine. It means actually the United States full force is going to come in and invade Russia. Now, that's a huge disaster for the United States and the rest of NATO.
And for the world.
And for the world, yeah, exactly right. But I guess, first of all, I don't think it's necessarily 100% up to him. But even if it were, can we really say with any certainty that he's just a crazy person who wants to watch the world burn? I would guess not. I think this is more, as we've discussed previously, we need to show we need to display that we're an imperialist power to be taken seriously, and we're not going to be consumed by the West and the United States and that kind of thing. We're our own empire.
Yeah. Anyways, I think we should move on to the next headline, which is that the House has just passed a series of police funding bills, most specifically the Invest in Police Act, or was it Invest to Protect? Let me just check for a second.
Invest to Protect.
Invest to Protect Act, which gives $60 million to local police departments around the country. And this came at a time where the real main point of this is a handful of progressive Democrats tried to stall the bill or tried to prevent it from getting it through. But of course, their issues were not that it gave money to the police, but that it did not have enough accountability measures in for it. Which, of course, that is the eternal complaint, that there's just not enough accountability. Police don't have enough accountability. The issue is never with the police itself. It's that no one's really watching them. But of course, this did pass, and it passed because Nancy Pelosi and the House establishment Democrats were able to convince one of the members to just vote present, which meant that it would be on the floor. And eventually did get voted through because the entirety of the Republican Party supported it. Almost all the establishment Democrats supported it. It was only just a couple of no votes from people like Cory Bush. But, it's interesting because Ilhan Omar had a statement that I read in a New York Times article about the subject and basically tried to portray this as a good thing, as a positive thing. Because it shows that Democrats, they're willing to get stuff done. They're able to push through despite the odds. Of course, what they're able to push through despite the odds are vastly supported by the Republican Party and by the establishment Democrats, which just so happen to give a lot of funding to an already pretty imploded police state. But whatever, they were able to get it done.
This is, I think, kind of a push by the Democratic Party to create this this view that we're this practical party in power, like leading up to the midterms here. It's really, to me, there's a lot of irony in Ilhan Omar saying that as being, because she's a representative from Minnesota, isn't that correct?
Yep, she's from Minneapolis.
That's just unbelievable. Like, her sort of praising this being from the flashpoint of the anti-police protests in 2020, and the backlash to the murder of George Floyd. And so she's just saying this like brazenly, like clearly she's the type, like, I'll give her the benefit of the doubt. I think she probably goes into Congress thinking like, oh, I'm going to change the system from the inside. But, I think it's a prime example of the inside changes you. And you're just going to say what the party wants you to say because you're now a part of it. You're like, you can't just pretend to not, you can't like run as a Democrat and pretend not to be one. As much as like that
exact same thing
wing has been doing.
I'm just saying the exact same thing happened to AOC, where like in the very beginning she was like portrayed as this outsider who's like she's gonna fix the system from the inside. And now every time I think about AOC, I just think about like losing your soul. Because
I think about that ridiculous ballroom dress.
God. Eat the Rich, or was it just Tax the Rich?
All you can do is just rhetoric. That's the only thing you are able to do. You're able to like make a speech, but in any practical action, you're fucked.
In the seats of power of a bourgeois system, the only solutions are bourgeois solutions. And like, it doesn't matter that like supposedly like Omar is a socialist, whatever that means, like, or that Bernie endorsed her, or that she's friends with AOC. And again, like, whatever the relevancy of any of that is to the working class, like, even when you're just attempting to be a like libbier lib than the other liberals in the Democratic Party, like, you're going to get pulled into these like bourgeois conventions. And like, the reality is Biden's facing a lame duck presidency after these midterm elections in all likelihood, like, historically, unless the GOP's strategy of Trumpifying the party backfires on them. The reality is, like, from a Washington Post article, that abolishing the police might be popular with like Omar's electoral base, but it's not popular with those like undecided independent voters that the Democrats are in a constant state of courting. And it's not popular with the establishment wing of the party either. So like, this is just another example of like, ultimately, like, you can't even push this party to the left within its own conventions, let alone like have any kind of like radical revolutionary or like working class perspective within it.
Yeah. And just something else I want to touch upon is the Democrats' reasoning for supporting this bill were quite explicit. We have a statement from Representative Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey saying, and I quote, around the country, this is going to send a very clear signal that Democrats support law enforcement. And they're all concerned with that because they have this desperate attempt to make themselves like appealing to centrists and like moderate, the quote unquote moderate Republican. And the funny thing is that they know this isn't going to work. The DCC, the DCCC, which is basically like their committee for congressional campaigning, issued a statement basically saying that, yeah, Republicans will just lie and say that we're anti-police, and yes, it will most likely be successful.
This whole like,
the
Democrats
They
just like pretending to be the moral superior is just laughable for one, and for two, like never works. It never works.
No, it's so transparent that people, like, except for their own true believers, like normal like people see it and hate them for it. And it's been the case forever.
I think that they would have more respect if they did just openly say, yeah, we don't like the cops. Because maybe they won't get any more popular, but at least people would go like, hey, say what you will about those Democrats. They at least like say what they believe.
I'd be willing to say that like basically every federal Democrat does love the police, though. Like this is these are bourgeois people in a bourgeois institution.
Yes,
like
we're talking about like this hypothetical Democratic Party where like where this is just like they're just trying to gain popularity. I think you're right in saying that no, they do just like the police. It's just that doesn't matter because most Republicans are going to say that they hate them anyway.
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, we live in the world of QAnon also, so it doesn't really matter, like, what is said.
Oh, yeah.
QAnon is like this hydra of conspiracy theory, like, where it's absorbed all of the conspiracies that have been, like, kind of floating around in the background into itself. And also, like, the, like, rising movement to, like, sanctify Trump, in addition to like the anti-Semitic conspiracies that didn't historically do as well, like with the general population. And like, I think, yeah, saying it's a big tent is probably pretty accurate. Anyway, this is a tangent.
Yeah. Another thing that kind of just made me roll my eyes is how it is currently September of 2022, and we are still talking about January 6th, like it just happened yesterday. Coming back from that New York Times article, which is entitled "House Passes Police Funding Bills with Democratic Rifts on Vivid Display," they quoted this kind of line of dialogue that happened in the House, where a Republican member was like, "The Democrats are cynically just doing this to make it seem like they aren't the cop haters that they are," and then some Democratic Congresswoman in like an impassioned voice talked about like, where was your support for the cops on January 6th? And it cannot be stressed. One police officer died not even during January 6th. He died the day after. And they're using him as like this martyr. They're using all those cops, all those DC Metro Police and like Capitol Police officers who like waved in like MAGA protesters and rioters into the Capitol building as like, we stand with you. And it's just like, it's the most like cynical and honest. It's like, it's revolting. I get a bad feeling every time I see it because nothing happened ultimately on January 6th. Nothing happened. They broke in, they smashed a few windows, and then they all left. Something I was recently re-listening to like a podcast, and they were talking about January 6th, and something that one of the hosts said was very kind of poignant. And that was when those people entered the Capitol, they stayed within the roped lines. Like they didn't burst through the queue. It was like they were just like entering the Capitol building. Like none of these people had any delusion of like making a giant mess or trying to like overthrow the government like outside with any concrete action plan. No. So it's just delusional that we're still talking about it, and we're still talking about it like it's fucking 9/11.
It's part of just the mythology, right? Like they just have to create this story about something sacred. In this case, the Capitol building representing democracy. And if you were on the wrong side of that, then you're not for America. And that's, of course, like America meaning the police or, what have you, whatever excuse they're using for a political gain at the moment.
I think you're right about that, Seamus. Like, fundamentally, I think the reason that this is so offensive to the liberals is that it's such a like slap in the face to like proper decorum and procedure that they fetishize like so strongly. But I also think there's an element to it where like they were threatened, like the government, the liberal, like the bourgeois liberals in control were threatened by the reactionaries instead of it being working class people. So now, like, nobody drove their car into them and killed them. But this is now the biggest, like, most horrible thing that's happened in the United States since 9/11 because they were the targets. And like it's a philosophical smack in the face to their delusions of propriety. But like regardless of like the actual outcome, like for once they were the victims of reactionary right-wing violence instead of marginalized working class communities. And I think that like doubly offends them.
I think that's a good point.
I would agree, but only partially, because if they truly were that terrified of it, then they should be like demanding for these people, like not just like the people who were there, but like Republican congressmen to like be thrown in jail. They should be demanding for, was it Josh Hawley who gave like that salute to them? They should demand like that he's having an investigation, but they're not doing that. They keep talking about like trying to reclaim a mythical moderate GOP.
So I don't think they were literally terrified. I think that they were offended and like, but they've used it. They've absolutely used it as political theater since. Speaking of House Republicans, like they put metal detectors in like the chambers of Congress because they claim that they're in fear of the more right-wing members of the Republican Party being there, that they're, essentially like an extension of January 6th. So, I mean, there has been like some interpersonal stuff between them and the right-wingers in their own cabal, like related to it. But like, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that I think that they are like literally in terror now. But I do think that they're just deeply offended both at the fact that they were the target and to the breach of decorum.
Yeah.
All right, guys, why don't we move on to our last headline, protests in Iran. Now, these began with the killing of a 22-year-old Kurdish woman for not wearing her... God, I can never remember what it's called.
It wasn't even that it wasn't on. From what I read, it was that it was too loose.
Oh,
her head covering.
Yeah, okay. So she was killed by the morality police.
So the story that we have so far is that she was arrested, taken to custody, and then all of a sudden she died. The Iranian state so far is basically saying that, it was natural consequences, but anyone with a brain can easily understand that, she was killed in there.
Right. Yeah, so this has sparked protests across the country with, women proudly kind of taking off their headscarves, burning them. There have been calls for the death of the Ayatollah, or like death to Khomeini. So this is, some pretty intense stuff going on in Iran, with a lot of violence being perpetrated against the protesters, of course, but it seems like there's quite a lot of violence being there's a lot of violence in response to police violence by the protesters. I mean, every once in a while we do see kind of these uprisings against the state. pretty much there's just, it seems to me, a general just feeling of being fed up with the Islamic Republic. I guess.
Yeah, because there were election protests back in 2009 also.
Oh, yeah, okay. I think that's what I'm thinking of. It's a little interesting that I was reading. It was from a Spanish source, so it wasn't like I had to Google Translate it, so it wasn't like everything was absolutely clear. But they said something like most of the households. All households supported economically by women are below the poverty line and constitute the poorest tenth of society. So these are, women who are, so obviously the content of the protests, it's more than just working class women. However, it is kind of telling that there's a lot of women who are forced to provide for their families, and they are just treated like absolute dirt. So if you see these women kind of coming out and saying, screw it, I'm just not going to take it anymore, I think that's something to behold. It's really kind of what I think of when I think of what really causes a revolution. It's really the fact that you just can't take it anymore. You have to change something, or you're just gonna live in complete misery. Like, I guess that's sort of there's a kernel of that revolutionary attitude in these protests, and I think another thing that's important is that some of the working class struggle committees have come out and publicly have supported these protests, which, any avenue to weaken the Islamic Republic is definitely going to be favorable for workers. Of course, it's just a question of where do they go from there?
So, as an interesting aside, Seamus, since you mentioned that this situation's like what we're seeing in Iran can be like the catalyst for a more widespread movement. We can't forget that it was a International Women's Day demonstration that was kind of one of the catalysts for 1917 in Russia.
Right.
So there's a lot of historical truth to that statement. And, in the context of petroleum workers over the summer striking also, this is undoubtedly a cross-class movement right now, but there could be the potential to see something more proletarian in nature develop. And we'll have to keep a good eye on it.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot. Iran has a very interesting recent history. I guess if you go just back to the 20th century, I don't know if you guys have ever read, what was it? It's like a graphic novel.
Persepolis?
Yeah, Persepolis.
Yeah.
Just kind of an interesting account. Obviously, it's one person's account, but just going from rule by the Shah, of course, installed by the United States.
It should also mention that she was pretty upper class, so you do have to take it with a grain of salt. But it is an interesting.
Yeah, and it is interesting that some of her family friends were like
communist.
Yeah, they were communists. They were Marxist-Leninists, so probably not communists.
Stalinists.
Yeah, they were probably not communists by our definition. But we do it is kind of interesting that there has been in Iran a at least a nominally communist movement.
And now it's illegal to be a communist in Iran.
Yeah, I mean, so it's clearly the Islamic State has the Islamic Republic has a whole lot to lose. Obviously, I think that a bourgeois revolution is not possible because it really is a bourgeois state. Like the leaders of the state live as the bourgeois do here. There are privately owned companies that exploit the working class. So yeah, you might get these kind of reforms in the bourgeois context, but the real fear, I think, is an actual working class movement.
I agree, but I'm going to remain, like, if this continues and regime change becomes a possibility, I'm going to remain personally cautious, because while Iran itself is still a bourgeois state, it's a highly repressive and theocratic one. And frankly, like, a lot of the measures that they take are no longer necessary to control the working class, like economically and politically. The heavy-handed policing approach tends to breed resentment, and the subjugation of women. Like, we've seen that the bourgeois class has weaponized the women's liberation movements of the past to double their workforce at half of the pay. So there is a lot of room for a modern, more secular, less heavy-handed, but still thoroughly bourgeois, political outcome, even if these protests continue to the point of regime change without a solid working class element pushing for communism. And also the same libs that we were talking about earlier would hail that as progress, even if it's just oppression of a different form.
Anyway, I think there is, it is nice to see pushback against the state, any state, in this current era. And these aren't peaceful protests, and I say that positively. Like, they are getting into confrontation with the police. They are pushing up against police barricades. And so I think that there's quite a lot of positivity and hope in that.
It's like I said earlier, it has that kernel of, we're just at our breaking point, and we're gonna do whatever we need to do, because you're going up against riot police in Iran. I mean, there's a good chance that you're gonna die. So if you're gonna take that risk, I
might as well go.
Or it's just you're obviously at a point where the current state of affairs is not tolerable. All right, guys, why don't we move on to
the big topic?
So,
starting from today, I just read from PBS NewsHour that, at least according to officials, the boil water ban, the boil water order has been lifted, and that pressures come back to the pipes in Jackson, Mississippi. But if you have been paying attention to social media or digging sometimes pretty deep into the headlines, you would understand that since around late August is when the state of emergency was announced. Jackson, Mississippi has a city of 150,000 people, 80% of whom are Black, absolutely no clean water. And for a long portion of that, just no water at all, because there just wasn't enough pressure in the pipes. But like a lot of things, the story does not begin now or within the past month. It really begins all the way back in 2010. In 2010, their water treatment facilities, their main one, which is O.B. Curtis Water Plant, got damaged by winter storms, which caused outages throughout sections of the city. And then in 2012, when the EPA came to investigate the facility, they determined that they had failed to meet up with safe drinking water standards. And that's just the decade ago. In 2021 is when things get... That's when the dominoes begin to get close. In February 2021, another winter storms completely shut down the O.B. Curtis plant somewhat briefly and required it to have to switch to its backup intake in pumps. The city, after an investigation, determined that it would cost around $47 million to repair the treatment plant to its full capacity. However, the state of Mississippi only agreed to pay $3 million for repairs. And so, that all being said, we are now in August of 2022, and another set of storms hit Mississippi, this time completely flooding the Pearl River. And by flooding the entire Pearl River, the water treatment facility of O.B. Curtis, already only relying on its backup pumps, just completely breaks down. And it is completely unable to treat any water anymore. And so now you have a state of emergency in which the city of Jackson and I believe a couple surrounding smaller cities in the area, maybe not cities, but sizable populations who also rely on O.B. Curtis for their water. Now they just don't have any water. And so a state of emergency is announced by the White House, and National Guard is deployed to deliver hand sanitizer and drinking water to the citizens of Jackson. And that has been the situation for a while. There were pretty grim videos of just these long, like bread line looking, just lineup of cars. But of course, it's not for bread, it's for water. It's for clean drinking water. And that has been the situation up until around the past couple of days, where, as I just said, at least according to city officials, water is back up. The plant has been repaired. Although it should be mentioned, at least from what I read, they still have a cautionary advisory for children and pregnant women.
Which is, I mean, if there's a cautionary advisory, that means they don't know if the water's safe. And
yeah,
like
my understanding is
E. coli, what have you.
Oh, I should mention, I got the date wrong. On September 15th, the Jackson water supply was fully restored and boil advisory was withdrawn, although the State Department of Health still advised precautions for pregnant women and children. The one I read today is coming from today, the 25th, and the headline is entitled, "In Jackson, the tap water is back, but the crisis still remains," so perhaps that precautions were now lifted too. So we kind of came to this story quite literally at the end of the crisis, quote unquote. That is to say, this manifestation of the crisis. But the crisis is still there. And in order really to understand that, we have to kind of go back to history again. And we need to talk about Jackson, Mississippi as a city and its position in Mississippi society. It is, I believe, the largest city in Mississippi, 150,000. It is 80% Black. During the era of white flight, most of the white residents in Jackson fled, and they went to the new, wealthier white suburbs. And of course, when you have the population of your town that statistically had more wealth due to segregation and various other aspects of America's history of racism, that now means that, your city isn't getting a lot of money anymore. And so that is really the reason for why, for the past decade, Jackson has just been having hurdles with its water treatment facility and just crossing its fingers and hoping that it just doesn't completely break down. But, now that is the case. And I guess the rest of this little segment should be devoted to talking about capitalism and its relationship to racism, especially in the United States, and just how in the capitalist mode of production, the common welfare of a population, of society, is not a primary focus. It is not even really a secondary focus. It exists only insofar as it can maintain itself, or until, like in this instant, it just completely breaks down and you have to start worrying about, people might die. Like large swaths of people might die. And that's never really good. But it is purely reactionary. There is no real incentive to be precautionary or to invest in something that has not yet broken.
Yeah.
So, any of you subject?
Yeah. So I did want to bring up that a class action lawsuit was filed recently against the city, as well as some of the private firms that maintained the water system. So basically, all this was because of all the health problems that resulted from this. So, at the very least, we can tell that there's almost no recourse for these people to actually find relief from these problems. First of all, because there's, like you said, there's no precautionary measures taken. It's when it comes to something that's run by the state, especially in a area where you have mostly black and poor working class people, you're just not going to get any investment, because they have what they need. They'll get to work, they'll produce, and they'll be fine. It doesn't matter to the state or to the rest of the bourgeoisie that working class people don't enjoy the clean drinking water, sort of the basics that we think modern society should have.
I'm just thinking more about this, and obviously the comparisons are pretty obvious, but when you think about Jackson, you just can't help but think about Flint. And you just can't help think about Cancer Alley and all these places in America where the standard of living is, like, to a degree, or like drops in standard of living in times of crisis are to a degree that the United States would bemoan developing nations for not supporting. And we're just totally fine with it, because guess what? All those areas are predominantly black. Cancer Alley is predominantly black. So no one really cares that they have, like, higher rates of cancer in their children or in their elderly. Or Flint, who cares about lead in the water when it's a majority black city? Or Jackson, who cares if they quite literally just don't have water because it is an 80% black city. But something I actually should have touched upon is maybe you could have gleaned it out when I was talking about the background. But this crisis is only going to get worse, and it's only going to get worse because of the impending ecological collapse of this planet.
Yeah.
All these catastrophes in Jackson thus far have been the result of some kind of flood or some kind of severe winter or some kind of severe storm that has just completely decimated its infrastructure. And that's not going to get better. Like, unless something drastic is done immediately, unless we do relatively soon say, have a social revolution and decide to be rid of the profit incentive and the production and maintenance for the sake of producing money or producing wealth, and replace it with a system in which things are done just for their use value or for the benefit of maintaining the quality of life of its citizenry. Jackson and other cities like it are just going to get hit more and more. And honestly, the most frustrating aspect about that is that it's going to hit people who had absolutely nothing to do with it the hardest. Like we just saw with Pakistan, an entire nation essentially underwater, like massive floods, hundreds of thousands of people displaced. What is Pakistan like? What is its people who consume, I guarantee, only like a fraction of what the average American family consumes, or like what the average major polluter produces. And yet it's people in the developing world, it's people in the poorest regions of this country that are going to get hurt and hit the hardest and first. And that, like, it's frustrating because on a sense, it kind of feels like there's no justice in this world. Like you would expect that the people who are responsible for this would get like hit by it first, and it would be almost like a karmic punishment. But we can't even have that. No, it's just people who don't deserve suffering.
No, I mean well, I don't want to say like it's like it was designed this way. It's certainly no accident that the white flight happened.
Because like when we look at white flight, what was kind of what started with white flight, and it was when all the laws that basically said it is illegal for a black person to be in this area. When those got lifted, a lot of white people kind of quickly figured out, oh, we don't even need those laws. If we just create an area where it is more expensive to live, that's going to allow us to be able to live in our own isolated little pods, and it will keep out not just black people who don't have that money, but also who we consider to be the worst of white people, which is to say poor white people, which is to say probably in this area and around this time, more blue collar, working class white people.
So
that's what all those suburbs were created for. It was an economic way of just enshrining segregation.
So, there's the material reality that like through the segregation, the new segregation of white flight after the fall of Jim Crow, they can focus their resources, like predominantly tax resources, from the entire population into those white communities, and just basically neglect the communities left behind, like in places like Jackson, Mississippi. And also, like two kind of related points, when you read some of the comments made by the state government in response to Jackson's like ongoing requests for aid for this situation that go back like a decade, they are like offensive and paternalistic, like in a very like mask off racism kind of way. Like one of the quotes I saw came from the Mississippi governor saying that if the people of Jackson had learned to bill for water usage correctly, they wouldn't be experiencing this, and that if they could like adjust their billing processes, they could fix their own problem. Like that's just like it's a so-called market-based solution that's not going to work. And two, it's just patently offensive and like condescending immediately on its face. Like you can read the subtext there very easily. Yeah. Like they're speaking down to an entire community, like this governor, as if they were speaking to children and like tisking them. for their poor allocation of resources. And
that was, and this was from reading like a response from the governor. One of the things they talked about is like, maybe we need an independent oversight committee because these people, it was like they're incapable of like overseeing their own water. No, that was never the problem. The issue was that they needed $47 million in repair and you gave them $3 million.
Yeah.
That was the issue. They knew what was wrong.
No, it's just,
they didn't have any money.
Racism. Like, and they know it, and they don't want to spend that money. And like something else that I wanted to kind of tag on to, I don't know that they're necessarily in these like suburban, majority white, majority more affluent areas necessarily putting any more effort into maintaining their infrastructure than Jackson is, because there's a trend across the entire U.S. Where basically all infrastructure is being neglected. So it's entirely possible that these communities are going to end up eating crow in another decade or two, because their newer infrastructure starts to develop the same problems. Because the American Society of Civil Engineers specifically calls out roads, bridges, and water mains as like the things that they look at when they criticize the country more generally for its lack of investment in infrastructure, because there's no profit motive in infrastructure. So like, I think we're seeing like an amplified and intensified kind of exploitation of the people of Jackson. But I kind of think it's almost like looking into the future in a way to see a lot of the struggles that are going to hit other communities in the nearer future, where exploitation was not as intense as it is in communities like Jackson.
Yeah. I mean, all of this, doing this kind of podcast and, reading the news with like any knowledge of like, there is no hope in this system, it does kind of just give you the warning of like, something is coming. Like, it's going to get worse. And the question will have to be like, will we be prepared to then break with everything we know and push for a new society? Or, will we be like consumed by barbarism? Will it be socialism or will it be barbarism?
Well, and that makes there's a third option in that dichotomy these days, which is also like total annihilation.
Complete extinction.
But I mean, honestly, though, like, I think it really frankly becomes a question of whether or not the party is built. And like I think that the work that the ICT as a whole does to advocate for the formation of the new class party is the most important work that communists can be doing, like in the grand scheme of things right now. Because if the party doesn't form until after all of these events come to the head, then it might be too late to take actions at all. And I think that's why it's important for us to keep doing the work that we're doing and intervening in struggles and talking to the people in our personal lives and producing material like this podcast for people to listen to. Yeah. Because like, there can be hope for the future, but our time frame is really getting tight. Like, just looking at the ecological issues that capitalist production is causing right now, if nothing else, never mind the constant and generalized economic crisis that's continually hoisted upon the shoulders of the workers to pay for. But that's a subject for another episode.
Yeah. I think it would be probably wise. I know that this is a current events / news podcast, but maybe it would be a little wise to have like maybe a theory segment where we talk about not like a news topic or an event in depth, but rather like capitalism and its relationship to the destruction of ecology, for instance.
Well, or with the ongoing and like increasingly like intense coverage of Trump's paperwork in Mar-a-Lago, we might be left with not enough real news to talk about that we might have to do that sooner than later.
Yeah, that has been the top of Google News every day for like the past month.
Yeah, it has made getting anything done for this project much harder. There's so much to wade through.
We actually have to type into the search bar on Google News.
And then just scroll to the bottom and click page 3 and just start from there.
Yeah. We're really desperate for material. We have to click page 2 of the Google search.
And then then you're getting into
that's
here. So,
that's beneficial also, though, for the bourgeois status quo. That something like that subject can be so all-encompassing that it can push real news like the suffering of the people in Jackson into relative obscurity.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't know. Would you want to keep talking about this, or should we move on?
I mean, I personally don't have much more to say about it. I just thought it should be important for us to talk about it because it was like I saw those videos of like just these massive lines of people in their car in the heat, just like waiting to get like a packet of bottled water from the National Guard. And I was just thinking to myself, this is not emblematic of a healthy society.
No, the signs of
collapse.
Yeah, or just the decay of capitalist society are just so plain to see. But people are just so desperate to go back. We just need to go back to when it was good. I mean, people. I mostly mean the ideologists, and politicians, of course. So I guess, in some sense, it's worth mentioning that we're looking for something beyond what we've seen already. Like, that's what we mean when we talk about communism. It's the next society, that which is born out of capitalist society, born out of the revolution out of capitalist society, but it is something fundamentally different. It's like, I remember, like, in the educational group, there was recently a chat. I think both of you guys were involved, about like some group came up with a set of planks for the transitional period.
Yes, I said that. It was like a tweet thread that someone made.
Yeah,
and I replied to it.
Yeah, I remember that, and I think Tom, that was a good reply because. And I remember, I think one of the ed group members was arguing with you a little bit about, that, well, if Marxism is a science, isn't like the science part of it supposed to be able to predict things? And then, the important part is that Marxism is more a science of society as it is. Like, it's the immanent critique of society. So I think that's why it's actually so important, is that we're looking right now, we're seeing a society in just going to shambles. It's just in such a bad state right now. I know it's kind of easy for us to say that. I think there's always a lot of people who are like, oh, everybody just thinks it's always getting worse.
No, it's getting worse.
It is. I think you're right. Like, I think it actually is getting worse.
Steven Pinker, like you can cite like medical innovation all you want. That doesn't mean that people actually have any access to that.
Right. Yeah. So
it's not getting better, Steve. It's getting worse, and I can feel it, and we can feel it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's plain to see, but what's important is identifying that this is all rooted in a society that is profit-driven. And this is all because it's all because that this society has to produce commodities. Like,
Yes.
racism is born out of colonialism, born out of primitive accumulation of capital. This is all to do with the way we organize our working life. So that's why this is all important. So I guess, like, yeah, there's a little dose of the justification of the theory, I guess, but it also speaks to why this kind of stuff is important too. Like, digging through the articles and finding these stories that sort of put the subject matter on display. Like, we're trying to really examine this all very critically. So, not to be self-congratulatory or anything, but
Yeah.
I guess, like, I think it's important that we keep doing this. And just to reiterate what Tom says, that we also, like, working towards the future party. That is paramount, and I'm fully in agreement with that being sort of the highest priority task of communists at the moment.
Yeah. If anyone couldn't notice, we are currently missing Aisha. She had something come up and was thus not able to join us for this episode. And for that reason, we initially planned on also doing a more in-depth discussion about the railroad workers, unions, the strikes, and the White House. But we promised Aisha that we would discuss that with her because she has been the one who's been keeping up with this the most of all of us. But since she's not here, we're going to save that topic for the next episode. And by that point, we'll probably have more information about the quote tentative agreement that the unions allegedly made. Although with more investigation into that, it seems like turns out that actually was not true.
Right.
But is there any quick thoughts? Anyone want to share about that? Because we will be discussing it in depth when Alicia is with us next time.
I guess just a thought that I want to mention is just, I was originally skeptical of the ICT's position on unions when I first got involved with this organization. Not in any sense like I was thinking unions are the key to the revolution or what have you, but just because they, at least at first, historically, were meant to slow the onslaught of capital for the benefit of the working class. And it was an association of the working class, again, in theory. This whole debacle with the railroad unions has just really solidified to me that the ICT's position on unions is the correct one.
Yeah.
Time and time again, unions really just throw the actual working class under the bus. And go ahead.
I was just gonna say, give some of the council communists a little bit of credit on that one too, because they also have had that line for around the same time as the ICT.
Okay, well, I honestly wouldn't know, but if they do, then I think they're correct as well. Like this, the union here, and I'll just be very brief. The union here basically announced, in order to avert a strike, that they had reached a tentative agreement with the rail bosses, the companies, with mediation also being supplied by the Presidential Emergency Board, or emergency whatever, the PEB. Basically the White House intervening and saying, okay, you can't have a strike because that's going to cost the economy $2 billion a day.
Yeah.
The union comes out and says, oh, we've reached a tentative agreement. for days, no one in the rank and file has access to the agreement, can't read it, and then suddenly they announce that there was no real agreement. They just said that our tentative agreement is what the PEB recommended, which is just ridiculous because it doesn't at all get to the heart of why these workers were going to go on strike in the first place. Namely, being the fact that they have almost no time off. They have to devote 90% of their entire life to being on call. Very dangerous conditions where people are falling asleep. They're exhausted while driving these trains. So it's infuriating to see the unions say, like, to do all this in the name of averting the strike so the economy can go on, and more importantly, that Biden can get a good result in the midterms. So anyway, that's my little rant for that.
I'm actually like really glad you brought that up, Seamus, because in my experience, the question of the labor unions is one of those things that people tend to get hung up on when like analyzing the ICT's positions. But there's a lot of reasons for that. Like, I grew up with, my dad was an iron worker. He was in a union. It was a very strong union. He got great benefits. So like, I had a natural propensity towards supporting unionization as well. Until I worked for other unions in different industries, and became more skeptical of them. But this broad fetishization of the labor union among the leftists is also like a relatively recent occurrence. Like, there were debates in Lenin's time about the role of communists in labor unions. And Lenin advocated for the worker, or for communists to agitate within the labor unions because that's where the workers were, but never believed that the unions were a road to socialism.
Not even Marx believed that.
No,
like, that was even in was it Wage, Labor, and What was the one where he was talking about Citizen Weston? Was that Value, Price, and Profit? I believe it was that one.
I think it was that one, yeah.
Well, like, at the very end of that, he talks about, like, yeah, the unions are all fine and good at defending, like, or winning rights in a capitalist system, but they themselves are incapable. They're not going to be able to have a revolutionary potential.
Yeah, and this was well known during the 1800s, during the First International, and during the Second International, like even with the rise of the revisionists. And it's only in the modern post-Stalin era that we see this total fetishization of labor unions, like most of which are derived from Samuel Gomper's AFL-CIO. And Gompers himself was... he specifically designed the approach of the AFL-CIO to be accommodating to business. Like, there was a time when when unions were either joining the AFL-CIO or joining the Wobblies, like in the late 1800s. And we can see like which direction we've gone. So yeah, people have a very visceral reaction to the stance on unions. So I think it's important for us to bring these kinds of issues to the forefront, and without creating any kind of like ideological messes for us to clean up later. When you look at the positions of unions from other unnamed groups on the communist left, I think you'll see that ours are probably the most informed by reality.
Yeah.
Because while we do have a thoroughgoing criticism, full-throated of the unions, we don't ban union membership, nor do we idealize alternate forms of permanent unions. So
I think our position is probably the best that you can have, which is that, like, a union, like, if your workplace is unionized, like, you shouldn't, like, scream and shout and demand that everyone leave the union, and that I'm just correct me if I'm wrong, but this was in an article that Dom wrote where he didn't have an issue of like being a member of a union or even like propagandizing inside of a union. It's just that unions are not the way out.
Correct.
That's
and
right.
as the struggle intensifies, the union will ultimately act as a pressure release valve for the greater bourgeois system, giving the bosses outcomes that are palatable to them while also making the workers feel like they've achieved something. It's not a means to an end.
It's purely defense.
But
and even then, sometimes it's not that.
Right, especially in this case with the rail workers. All right.
I think that's done. I think
does that wrap it up? Okay.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, we will. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to agree with you guys.
Okay.
Sorry, I've been interjecting all night.
That's okay. Fine. All right. Well, I hope our listeners had or they got something out of this, and we will talk to you guys next time.